Let's now look at customizing network threat protection and application device control. Lesson 8. So a number of objectives here. We're going to look at the tools for customizing the network threat protection, things like locations and location awareness. We're going to manage the policy components, configuring the learned applications, and configuring system lockdown. So, tools for customizing network threat protection. Well, we have a number of different areas that we can utilize for network threat protection. We can set up locations. We've mentioned these before. We can set up multiple locations that are set by certain criteria to affect different policies. We can set up host groups and network services and network adapter listings to apply those to policies. We can set up learning about the applications that are running on the clients, and that will help us make certain rules within our firewalls. And the system lockdown to enable us to be very sure about what applications are running with fingerprinting. Let's first look at locations and location awareness. Remember, we have the group structure and the subgroups, and we can create certain locations within these groups. Here we can see the remote and office locations being created. And it's the SEP client that constantly monitors the configuration settings of these triggers to decide which location should be applied at the time. Here we've got the office and remote or default location settings and how we apply them. We can see in the setting below the remote specific policies. So managing policy components. There are additional components that are available to help with the network threat protection. We've got host groups and fingerprint lists, the network services and adapters, and the hardware devices that we can manage. We could define certain host groups. It's sometimes useful to group together certain hosts under a certain reference, and they could then be applied to, maybe with the firewall rules. Here we're defining host groups under the firewall. We saw this a little bit earlier. We may need to define additional network services. When we're applying the firewall rule, if the network service isn't the one we wish to use, we can add in one and change the settings. And here we can see we can now apply that new network service that we've added in. And similarly with the network adapters, it could be use a different type of VPN than that's by default installed in the SEP product. So you could add in the network adapter and give it a name and identification. And once it's added in, we could then look at it and search for it within the firewall rule set and add it in as the adapter of choice. So how do we configure learned applications? Learned applications is where the SEP client themselves listen and gather information about every application that the client are running, and that information is logged and then uplifted into the SEP database. That information can be used by the security administrators to maybe define certain rule sets and to be sure about what applications are allowed and which are disallowed. Once the data has been uplifted from the client and is held on the SEPM database, the query tool can search through these applications and the administrator can use this information. To enable learned applications, it needs to be set on in a couple of places. The first place, it must be enabled as at the site level. That will just enable the learned applications to be used. And then we can configure it lower down in each of the different group levels that we wish to gather for those clients. So here we can see at the group settings, underneath the policies and communications setting, we can tick the upload box. And that's to tell the local SEP client to upload the learned applications for that particular client. We can also do it for location specifically. And then we can use that application lists when creating our firewall rules. As an administrator, you can search these applications within the SEP database. We can use the query tool, and we can choose the group structure and also the subgroups to search. You could use the search criteria of the client or computer information, or actually search for specific applications and see which clients are using them. In this way, you can define a whitelist and blacklist of applications. Here's our query results for the company Europe. And here we are selecting our SQL browser in step 1, looking at the details of what that particular application is that's been run. So configuring system lockdown. To configure system lockdown, you need to be very defined on which applications are running. If you want to be very specific, you'd want to create a file fingerprint list that is detailing the exact version and file type. You could then log unapproved applications and then add the allowed applications, therefore making a whitelist. And then enable system lockdown so that any applications that are running that aren't on the allowed list would be blocked. There's a warning there that's very worth noting. Take care not to apply system lockdown to the SEPMs. That's one of the key areas you must be very careful about, and it's a good idea to prevent this from happening by always making a separate group purely for the SEPMs, so you can apply different policies to those. So, file fingerprint lists, what are they exactly? Well, they are a checksum of the applications that are running on the particular client. Once you've created your checksum list of all the allowed applications, you can import them into the SEPM for then use within the policies. Here we can see we're creating a file fingerprint list on the client. We're running the checksum.exe to an output file, and then we're examining that output file data. And that's the data that would be imported into the SEPM. So now we can add that file fingerprint list. We go to the policies page, select the policy components, file fingerprint list, and then add file fingerprint list, specifying where that output file has been written. So how do we set the logging applications on during a testing phase? For the system lockdown for my company, for the whole site, we're going to set log unapproved applications only. So we're in test mode. We're not going to block anything yet. We can add in the allowed applications. So we're using the previously created file fingerprint list. We can have the following files are approved, and we can add in those particular file names. So once you've tested this thoroughly, you may want to enable system lockdown. And you select step 2, enable system lockdown. And that means all applications not in the approved application list will be blocked on this client that receives this policy. So that brings us to the end of this lesson. You should have learnt how to manage the locations, how to add policy components and configure application learning.